All right. Well, hello, listeners, and welcome to the Painkillers SPT podcast, where three student physical therapists talk about the latest sports research articles. My name is Jovan Jardine, SPT, and I am joined by my two other hosts. Go ahead and introduce yourselves, guys.
Hey guys, I'm Dane Tischendorf, student physical therapist.
And hi everyone, I'm Joey Carravetta, also student physical therapist.
Awesome. So let's get right into our article of the day. Dane, why don't you tell us a little bit about the article and how we got inspired to look into it?
Yeah, thanks, Jovan. So we can start by speaking about where this idea originated from. So Joey and I found that we both follow Dr. Aaron Horschig. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but goes by Squat University on Instagram, and he posts content on a ton of sports therapy interventions that I love to go through and watch and learn from, honestly. And he recently commented on the impact of narrow toe box shoes and has previously commented on cushion shoes versus minimalist shoes for running. After watching a video he posted, his stance on the topic is that high cushion shoes are not totally bad, but should at the very least be flat and not curved on the bottom, so they have essentially zero drop is what he considers it, which allows for that like bouncy or floating sensation that long distance runners might like or get with like the I wouldn't say infamous, but the Nike Alpha Flies, where they get that bouncy feeling from like a carbon plate. So then we found a cool article that encompassed this inspiration, and this article we found is called Effects of Court-Specific and Minimalist Footwear on Patellar Tendon Loading During a Maximal Change of Direction Task by Taylor Sinclair. So Joey, why don't you start by talking about what is the article's purpose and about their participants?
Yeah, so kind of before I go into that, going back on Squat University and kind of looking at how his views on the minimal toe box or the minimalist shoes are focused more in on the running and more weightlifting oriented activities. But with this article that we found, it seems to be more focused on people who are playing like court sports, so like basketball, soccer, tennis, stuff like that, where there's a lot of directional changes. So it's a little bit different, and so the views are kind of changed a little bit. But going into this study, it aimed to examine the effects of various footwear types, including court-specific shoes, minimalist shoes, energy return, and athletic footwear. And it's looking at how they affect the patellar tendon loading during a maximal change of direction. The participants that they included were 10 males with an average age of 24.32 years and an average height of 177.65 centimeters and an average body mass of 74.27 kilograms and needed to be free from the lower extremity pathology at the time. So, Jovan, why don't you tell us, our listeners, about how they set up this test?
Yeah, so the way they handled the procedure was by doing the following. So the participants were instructed to perform a maximal shuttle run cutting maneuver while striking an embedded force platform. They were also required to perform these tests while wearing one of those different shoes that Joey mentioned, which we will talk about in a bit. The different shoes were either the athletic footwear, and the specific one that was considered to be the athletic footwear was the New Balance 1260 V2s, or a minimalist shoe, which was the Vibram 5-finger ELX, a court shoe, which was the High-Tech Indoor Light, the Energy Return footwear, which was the Adidas Energy Boost. So those were one of the 4 different shoes that the participants were to wear during the different trials. The researchers would also take 5 successful trials in each footwear condition. It is important to note that a successful trial was defined as one in which the foot made contact with the force platform, and there was no evidence of gait modifications due to the experimental conditions. So with that, I do have a question for you, Dane. How did the study by Sinclair collect their data for their tests?
Yeah, from what I read, Sinclair collected their data by utilizing an 8-camera motion capture system, and that was just to collect lower limb kinematics. So using this, they were able to analyze the ground reaction force by using the embedded force platform that was placed 6 meters away from the starting line, as to represent the typical distance that court players are usually expected to run and then change direction. So it's kind of simulating that typical game scenario. They were able to assess patellar tendon kinetics through musculoskeletal modeling, and this was determined by dividing the knee extensor moment by the estimated patellar tendon moment arm. So the patellar tendon load was then normalized by dividing it by each participant's body weight, and frictional properties were analyzed using ground reaction force data to determine the coefficient of friction and rotational friction moment. So one cool thing about how they collected the data was the devices they used to track the participant's body. What they did to determine the 6 degrees of freedom was that they used a calibrated anatomical systems technique, which applied retroreflective markers on the first metatarsal, the fifth metatarsal of the foot, the calcaneus of the foot or the heel, and the medial and lateral malleoli, as well as the medial and lateral femoral epicondyles near the knee. So when defining pelvis segment markers, those were placed on the anterior superior iliacs, am I saying that right? ASIs and the PSIs. But carbon fiber tracking clusters were positioned on the shank and thigh segments. So, Joey, why don't you take over and tell our people about the different results the study found?
All right, so for the kind of the juicy stuff, what everyone was looking for in the results, the study included 2 different types of results. One was for patellar loading, tendon loading, while the other was for frictional characteristics. So first we'll talk about the patellar loading. So Sinclair found or subdivided the results for patellar loading into 3 subcategories. So patellar tendon load, time to peak force, and patellar tendon load rate. So for peak patellar tendon load, it was significantly, so the peak patellar tendon load was significantly greater in athletic footwear in relation to the energy return and minimalist conditions. Time to peak force was significantly shorter in the minimalist footwear in relation to the other shoes, and the patellar tendon load was significantly greater in the minimalist shoes in relation to the athletic and court footwear. Now we'll talk about the results for friction characteristics. So Sinclair also subdivided this into a coefficient of friction and rotational friction moment. What they found was that the coefficient of friction was significantly reduced in the minimalist shoes in relation to the energy return athletic and court footwear, and then rotational friction moment was significantly reduced in the minimalist in relation to the other shoes. So with all that information, we'll have Dane kind of explain what all of that really means.
Sure. I'll try my best. So the study indicated that with the data that they collected, it can be interpreted that when considering the rate at which the tendon was loaded, the minimalist footwear performed the worst and also had the lowest values for coefficient of friction and rotational friction moment. With that being said, it appears that minimalist footwear may place those who engage in court-based activities at increased risk from patellar tendinopathy. Although this study did come up with these findings, they did have their limitations. And a huge limitation of the study was that the sample size was only 10 participants, so it was not big by any means. And another limitation of the study was that biomechanical modeling, in which patellar tendon loading was estimated using mathematical modeling rather than direct measurement, which may introduce inaccuracies. I also wanted to add another limitation, which I don't think they've really talked about in the study, but if these athletes essentially just switched from a cushion shoe or a highly bouncy shoe and immediately just switch to a minimalist shoe, it's kind of putting more force on their tendons, and they're not used to such impact. So I think that could have a huge play into this that really wasn't mentioned. But altogether, these limitations have a direct impact on the interpretation of the results. So taking everything into consideration, I wanted to address a few other studies that complement the conclusion. So an article by Litterberman in 2010 concluded that minimalist footwear encouraged forefoot or midfoot strike patterns, which reduced initial ground reaction forces compared to heel strikes often seen in cushioned shoes. So it kind of had a different approach, but yeah, I mean, Joey, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. So the finding of some previous articles that we've looked at, so a critically appraised article by Yang et al. 2019, had similar findings. So they concluded that minimalist shoes convert rear foot strikers into forefoot strikers and help to avoid peak impact force and decrease loading rate for more efficiency, providing a means of reducing risk of running injury caused by impact forces.
So, I mean, yeah, I think if we can combine these findings with the Sinclair article, we can somewhat conclude that minimalist footwear can help long-term users decrease impact rate from like bony structures such as the tibia, where we may see a lot of issues arise, such as like in sprinters, runners, etc. Like shin splints is one of the most common injuries we'll see with that. So that instead of placing the load on the bony structures themselves, it places the load on the musculature, which we see through the increased likelihood of patellar tendinopathy in the study we're looking at.
Yeah, I just love these points, and I think it follows suit with a little more research that we did in that in an article by Ridge, it was found that minimalist footwear promotes strengthening of the intrinsic foot muscles, which may follow up for the lower extremity chain of the tibialis anterior strength, and may also lead to greater adaptation and resilience over time, reducing overall the risk of injury. On the other hand, an article by Andreo in 2022 found that cushioned footwear may lead to muscle atrophy or reduced strength of foot musculature due to its decreased need for active stabilization, possibly increasing the injury risk when transitioning to less cushioned footwear, kind of like what Dane was mentioning a little earlier.
So yeah, I feel like that could be a huge component of the study we're currently looking at. So if they're used to, more cushioned footwear and then they go off of that, then yeah, obviously it's going to increase their injury risk. Not saying that's a definitive conclusion, but needs to be taken into account. So ultimately, both types of footwear can lead to increased likelihood of injury, but it needs to be taken within certain context. So, for example, our critical appraisal article only lasted 12 weeks, and participants may have gone back to their previous footwear afterwards. So I think footwear needs to be a long-term decision, and it needs to be, worn commonly in these individuals. So especially if you're switching up to a more minimalist shoe to develop more natural gait and musculature strength, to then support that higher load being taken through the lower extremities. I don't think it's beneficial to switch back and forth. But acutely switching to minimalist shoes can lead to increased likelihood of injuries. But over time, if minimalist shoes are adopted as a primary shoe, it may actually decrease the risk of injury. So overall, I thought, our article that we chose for this podcast was a great one to introduce the idea, and a great initial article for others to take and really expand on this idea on how to employ minimalist footwear and what people it may or may not be applicable for.
Yeah, so I agree that this article was good, but I think what kind of tying everything together with everything we've kind of talked about and how to apply this information to either our patients or just people in general is that current research has showed, it seems that with these minimalist shoes, it's looking more at stuff like running, walking, and kind of what Squat University focuses more on in weightlifting, which is all very like cyclical or like simple movements, for better words to say. But like when these articles were looking at more dynamic movements, that cutting and changing, and I know that a lot of research, including the one we found, shows that minimalist shoes aren't really the best for that. So I think we really just have to look at what is the patient looking to do. If they're just running, or if they're just looking to be a recreational, just walker, just doing long distance stuff like that, the minimalist shoes might be a good option for them because it allows them to have that like natural spread of their toes, get that more proprioceptive feedback while they walk, and get more benefit out of that. But if there's someone that they're a football player, they love playing soccer, they love playing basketball, minimalist shoes might not be the best option, and that they should just stick with whatever their sport's highest kind of rated option is right now until more research comes out that can maybe find a better option that allow them to get that proprioceptive feedback from the minimalist shoes, but also keeping the actual safety and protection that is required for that sport. Yeah.
Nice. Well, like you guys all said, I agree on these issues and these topics. And overall, strictly speaking on the article that we read, I enjoyed the read for sure. I completely agree that there needs to be further evidence and research on this topic. And with all that being said, we do want to thank you guys for tuning in to the Painkillers SPT podcast. My name is Jovan Jardine.
I'm Joey Carravetta.
I'm Dane Tischendorf.
And we hope that you guys learned something new today. Until next time, Painkillers out.
Peace.